If I am here tonight, it is not to represent Swami Kriyananda. He's, as I said, nothing. But I have had the great privilege, honor, and joy of living for 3.5 years with one of the great men on this planet. And it is my privilege and joy to be able to share these things with you. And in fact, in my book, The New Path, what I have tried to do is present my life with Master, as I call him, in such a way that people would be able to say, well, I could have been there too. I want to include people. I don't want to say I had that luck, poor slobs. I wanted to be able to say, this is something we could all have. Sometimes people ask me, do I need a guru? I say, absolutely not. You don't need a guru. But when you reach the point where you desperately want to know God, then you do need a guru. And this was my search. And I hope it will be the search of many of you here, God willing, all of you. But when I was a young boy, you might say, 13 years old, I was born in Romania of American parents, so I don't really know what I am, neither fish nor fowl. But I had this deep desire to know what truth is, to know why we are here on this planet. And I thought that if I can ever find this truth, I do want to share it with other people. I don't want to keep the whole cheese for myself. And I began by trying to find truth through astronomy, because I'd always been inspired by the stars and the beautiful expanses of space. And in fact, I remember somebody gave me a telescope, 18X, not very strong, and I looked at it, and I looked at the moon, and I was so thrilled to see all those trees on the moon until I discovered it was just the dirt on the lens. I didn't even have it focused, but still, my desire was to show, to understand how this vast universe came into being and why. And I was making a telescopic lens, and it fell off after 6 months of patient grinding and broke on the floor, and I sort of lost heart. So then I turned to politics, and I thought, well, maybe through a good system, we'll find what we're looking for. And I tried with, I didn't know anything about communism, but my idea of shared wealth and so on. And I realized that wasn't going to make anybody happy. And I tried it through music, and I tried it through art, and I tried it through all sorts of things. Business I didn't need to try, because my father had been fairly high up in the Esso Corporation. I'd grown up with that, and I really didn't have any interest in that. I remember when I was 16, my father wanted to get me a tuxedo, and I said, Dad, don't bother. I'll never wear it. In fact, I'm never going to earn enough money to pay income tax. Well, it turned out to be true. I met Yogananda not very long afterwards. I was 22 years old, and from then on, I've lived for God. But I didn't seek God, and you might wonder, well, why? How can you seek truth and not think about God? The fact is that every church I had been to just let me down. I asked of them a loaf, and they gave me a stone. I was very bitterly disappointed with what the churches had given me. I didn't like churchianity. I didn't like the thought that if you belong to this organization, this church, go to these Sunday services, then you will find God, you will find salvation. And what was salvation? Struggling for eternity in that little body? My God, what a hell! And I remember, I wanted, as I said, to be a playwright. And I remember I went down to Charleston, South Carolina. There was a theater there, and I wanted to learn stagecraft. And one night, I went out for a walk into the evening, and I asked myself, everything that I've tried to seek an answer to, it always comes back to that question, God. Then surely there must be some understanding of God that I'm not getting in the churches. And I asked myself, what is God? And the next question came up, who am I? I must be a part of him or I wouldn't be asking that question. And then I thought, well, his consciousness, he must be conscious. He can't just be an abstract force. It isn't my brain only that makes me conscious. It must be something that I'm in tune with receiving. And I realized that God had to be infinite consciousness. And I found, as I meditated on it further, walking through the night, that when I was happier, when I was more clear-minded, when I felt more in tune with the universe, it was when I was more in tune with my higher self. And when I wasn't feeling those things, it was because I was less in tune. And I decided then and there, I was 21 years old, and I said, then I've got to seek God. That's the only purpose of life. There is no other reason we've been born, but I'll go on with that later on. I really decided from then on I would give my life to God. And I remember coming back to my apartment. I was sharing it with 4 other young men, and they sort of laughed at me because they saw me so serious. And what's the matter with old Don, they called me. And I just thought, these are a bunch of yapping puppies, and I just left the room. I couldn't stand that association. And I decided that I would become a hermit. Now, mind you, I had never heard of knowing God. I'd never known that anybody could know God. I'd never read books about saints. I'd never heard anything about Indian philosophy. All I knew was what the churches had taught me, which I absolutely rejected. And yet, I knew that this was what I had to do. And I began suddenly to think, am I going crazy? Has anybody in history ever thought this way? I must be going mad. And I remember trying to go upstate New York and trying to find what I was looking for in the peace of the country. Well, my book tells all about that peace. But I found a book on my mother's shelf. Somebody had told me in Charleston about a book called the Bhagavad Gita. And I didn't know that book. I didn't know anything about that philosophy, but somehow that name, it had a resonance with me. And I found a book on my mother's shelves when I came back to her. We lived in Scarsdale, but she was living temporarily in White Plains. And first of all, I read her Bible. I didn't have a Bible of my own. And I'm afraid I bogged down in the begats. So-and-so begat so-and-so and lived to be so many hundred years, and he died. I just thought, well, if God really had wanted me to follow that way, surely he'd have introduced me in some better way to the Bible than that. Because it just didn't say anything to me. And then I saw another book on her shelves, and it said, A Short World Bible. And when I read the excerpts from the Hindu teachings, I was absolutely floored. First of all, here was something that was talking about God as infinite. Well, that deeply appealed to my scientific side. God couldn't be just a man with a long white beard or a judge waiting to condemn people to hell. It couldn't be that. He must be something more. And this infinite. But then it also said, God is not, you can't limit him. There are millions of definitions of God, but you can't say he's this or that. He's everything. And then it said that no one person and no one religion can own God. And I thought, what a relief to hear that. And my father had just been, this was the working of karma, the working of God's will, anything you want to call it. But my father had been sent to Egypt to be in charge of an oil exploration there. And I was packing my mother up to go join him. And the day I put her on the ship, that day, I walked uptown New York and I found Autobiography of a Yogi. I tell you, it was, if my parents had been there, I, who knew absolutely nothing about these teachings, I don't know if I'd have had the strength of will to tell them I'm going out to do this thing, which they would have thought completely crazy. But they were powerless. Mother was on a ship, Dad was over there. We didn't have airplane travel in those days. Well, there were some, but not enough for that. And this was 1948. And I got this book, and I read it between tears of joy and tears of love. It was the most moving experience of my life. I really took virtually the next bus across the country. I had never thought that I would ever do this. I was an ordinary, arrogant young man. I never dreamed that I would say this to him, but I went 4 days and 4 nights across the country by bus. I went to Yogananda. He'd just finished lecturing in Hollywood Church. The first words I addressed to him were, "I want to be your disciple."